You've probably walked past a building and felt something shift. Not dramatically, just a small change in how the air feels, how sound carries, how your posture adjusts without you deciding to adjust it. Maybe it was a cathedral, maybe a mosque, maybe a temple you visited while traveling, maybe it was just old. But something about the space made you quieter, made you notice your footsteps, made you feel like you should whisper, even if no one told you to. And here's the strange part. You probably weren't the first person to feel that way in that exact spot. Not the first that day, not the first that year, maybe not even the first in 1,000 years. People have been walking into that space, adjusting their behavior, feeling that same shift for longer than you've been alive, longer than your grandparents were alive, longer than anyone you've ever known has been alive, which raises a question that sounds simple at first. Why did we start building these places, and why haven't we stopped? Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. There's a pattern that shows up everywhere humans have lived. Not just in some places, everywhere. If you dig deep enough into any civilization, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, China, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, pre-colonial Africa, the Pacific Islands, you'll find the same thing. They built temples, not after they had everything else figured out, not as a luxury once survival was secure. Often they built temples first, before they had reliable agriculture, before they had writing systems, before they had what we'd recognize as cities. They set aside space, called it sacred, and built something there that wasn't practical in the ordinary sense. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey was built around 9600 BCE, before farming, before pottery, before metal tools. Hunter-gatherers, people we assume were focused entirely on survival, carved massive stone pillars, arranged them in circles, and covered them with elaborate animal carvings. Then they buried the whole thing and built another one on top of it, and another, for 3,000 years. We don't know why. We don't know what they believed. We don't know what rituals happened there, but we know they kept coming back, generation after generation, doing something that required enormous effort and produced nothing you could eat, wear, or use as shelter. At some point, this stops feeling like a coincidence. The pyramids at Giza weren't just tombs. They were built with astronomical precision, aligned with constellations, oriented to cardinal directions with an accuracy that's difficult to achieve even with modern instruments. Thousands of workers spent decades moving stones that weighed several tons each. For what? We say for the pharaoh's afterlife. And that might be true, but that just pushes the question back one step. Why did the afterlife require that much stone, that much labor, that much precision? Why not a simple grave? Stonehenge, built over 1,500 years. Stones transported from over 150 miles away, arranged in a circle that marks solstices and equinoxes. No one lived there. No one was buried there, at least not initially. No practical function we can identify. Just alignment, just orientation, just something about the sky and the earth and where they meet. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the largest religious structure ever built, required the labor of thousands, took decades to complete, not for defense, not for storage, not for housing, for something else. The Parthenon in Athens, built at the height of Greek civilization, philosophy, democracy, mathematics, drama. They didn't need gods to explain the seasons anymore. They had geometry, they had logic, and yet they built a temple. They put their best artists, their finest materials, their most sophisticated engineering into a building that housed a statue of a goddess, a statue most people weren't even allowed to see. What were they building? Or maybe the better question, what were they building toward? Here's something worth noticing. Temples aren't efficient. If you're trying to survive, to grow food, to defend territory, to house people, temples are a terrible use of resources. They take years to build. They require specialized labor. They don't produce anything. And yet, every civilization made them a priority. Not just one temple, multiple temples, rebuilt them when they fell, expanded them over generations. Which suggests that temples weren't about efficiency. They were about something else. something that felt more urgent than efficiency. There's a theory in anthropology about sacred space. The idea is that humans need boundaries. Not just physical boundaries, walls, borders, property lines, but conceptual boundaries. A way to mark the difference between ordinary life and something else. Not necessarily the divine, just something other than the daily routine. Because without that boundary, without that distinction, everything becomes the same. Every moment is equivalent. Every space is interchangeable. Every action carries the same weight. And maybe humans can't live like that. Maybe we need some moments to matter more than others. Some places to feel different than others. Temples created that difference. When you walked into a temple, you weren't just entering a building. You were crossing a threshold, from profane to sacred, from ordinary to elevated, from the negotiable to the non-negotiable. That crossing wasn't decorative. It was functional. It told you here, different rules apply. Here you are not the same person you are outside. And here's the thing, we still do this. We might not call them temples, but we still create spaces that ask us to behave differently. Concert halls, courtrooms, memorial sites, museums. You don't take phone calls in a concert hall. You don't wear a hat in a courtroom. You don't laugh at a memorial, not because someone will punish you, but because the space itself asks something of you. It creates a boundary, a shift, a recognition that this moment is not like other moments. That's not religion. That's just how humans organize meaning. But temples did something else too. They gathered people, not randomly, regularly on specific days, for specific reasons, following specific patterns, harvest festivals, solstice celebrations, New Year rituals, rites of passage, birth, coming of age, marriage, death. The temple was where the community confirmed it was still a community, where everyone came together and did the same thing at the same time in the same way. That repetition created coherence. Because if everyone is just doing their own thing, farming their own plot, raising their own family, making their own decisions, what holds them together? What makes them us instead of just a collection of individuals who happen to live near each other? Shared ritual, shared space, shared behavior that gets repeated until it becomes identity. The temple was the anchor. You might disagree with your neighbor about 100 things. But when the harvest festival came, you both showed up. You both participated. You both knew the words, the gestures, the sequence of events. That didn't eliminate conflict, but it created a foundation underneath the conflict. A reminder that, despite differences, you were part of the same story. Without temples, that foundation fractures, and you can see it happening. In places where religious participation has dropped sharply, social trust has dropped too. Not immediately. Not perfectly correlated, but measurably. People still gather, of course, at concerts, at sports events, at political rallies, but those gatherings don't repeat the same way. They don't create the same continuity. You go to a concert once, maybe twice. It's intense, but it's temporary. A temple was something you returned to, weekly, monthly, for your entire life. Your parents returned to it. Your children would return to it. That return created something concerts can't. It created lineage, heritage, a sense that your life was part of something longer than your life. Here's another thing temples did. They imposed order on time. Without calendars, without clocks, time is shapeless. One day bleeds into the next. Seasons shift gradually. Years pass without markers. Temples created those markers. The winter solstice ritual, the spring planting ceremony, the midsummer festival, the harvest Thanksgiving, these weren't arbitrary. They were tied to agricultural cycles, to celestial events, to the rhythm of survival. But they also made time legible. They said, here is where one thing ends and another begins. Here is when we remember. Here is when we prepare. Here is when we celebrate. That structure wasn't just comforting. It was organizing. It told you when to plant, when to expect rain, when to store food, when to rest. The temple functioned as a calendar, a repository of collective memory about how to survive the year. And because it was sacred, people paid attention. If a priest said the planting ceremony was in 3 days, you planted in 3 days. Not because the gods would punish you if you didn't, but because the priest was the one tracking the stars, the seasons, the patterns that everyone else was too busy to notice. We don't need temples for that anymore. We have meteorology, agricultural science, Google Calendar, but we lost something in the translation. Time is no longer sacred. It's just sequential, one day after another. No markers except the ones we invent for ourselves, and those personal markers don't hold the same weight because they're not shared, they're not collective. They don't connect you to anyone else's experience of time. Your birthday matters to you. But it doesn't reorganize the community. The winter solstice did. There's something else that happened in temples, something harder to name. People experienced awe, not always, not everyone, but regularly enough that it became part of the design. The scale of the architecture, the height of the ceilings, the way light entered, the acoustics, the decoration, all of it was engineered, consciously or unconsciously, to create a feeling of smallness, of transcendence, of being in the presence of something larger than yourself. You can argue about whether that something was real, but the feeling was real, and the feeling mattered because awe does something to people. It reduces self-focus, it increases cooperation, it makes your own concerns feel less central. Not permanently, just temporarily, but temporarily might be enough. If you're struggling with your neighbor over a property line, or holding a grudge over a perceived slight, or obsessing over some personal anxiety, walking into a temple and feeling awe might reset that, not because you solved the problem, but because for a moment the problem felt smaller. And that shift, that recalibration, might be what communities needed to keep functioning. We still seek awe, at the Grand Canyon, at the ocean, in art museums, at concerts where the sound is so loud and so beautiful it overwhelms thought. We haven't stopped needing it. We've just stopped building architecture specifically designed to create it on a regular basis. Temples did that, weekly, monthly, cyclically. They didn't wait for you to travel to the Grand Canyon. They brought awe to you. Here's the uncomfortable part. What happens when temples disappear? Not physically. Physically, many are still standing, but functionally, when people stop going, stop participating, stop treating them as sacred, you might say nothing happens, people are fine, we don't need temples. And individually that might be true, but collectively something shifts. The markers disappear, time becomes shapeless. Communities fragment into smaller and smaller units. People still seek meaning, still seek belonging, still seek transcendence. But they seek it in ways that don't scale, that don't create continuity, that don't connect one generation to the next. They find meaning in careers, in hobbies, in political identities, in consumer brands, and those things provide some of what temples provided, but not all of it, because they're not designed to last. They're not designed to be inherited. They're not designed to hold an entire community together across disagreement. They're designed to be personal, individual, curated to your specific preferences, which means they can't do what temples did. They can't say, here is where we all return, no matter how different we are. Here is what holds us together when everything else pulls us apart. Maybe temples weren't about gods at all. Maybe gods were just the language people used to describe something else. The need for order, the need for continuity, the need for shared behavior that transcends individual preference. The need to feel small sometimes, to be reminded that your life is part of something longer, that the world is bigger than your immediate concerns, the need to gather, to return, to repeat. Not because repetition is mindless, but because repetition creates foundation, and without foundation, everything becomes negotiable, everything becomes temporary, everything becomes a matter of personal opinion, which sounds like freedom, but might actually be fragmentation. You've probably walked past that building again, the one that made you feel different, and maybe you didn't go in. Maybe you don't believe what it represents. Maybe you think it's outdated, unnecessary, even harmful, and maybe you're right. But here's what's worth sitting with. Every civilization built them. Not most civilizations. Every civilization, for thousands of years, with different gods, different rituals, different languages, but the same impulse to set aside space, to call it sacred, to return to it, to build something that pointed beyond survival. We've stopped building them, or we've started building different versions, stadiums, museums, monuments, but we haven't stopped needing what they did. We've just lost the language to ask for it. Why did every ancient civilization build temples? Maybe the question isn't why they did. Maybe the question is, what did they know that we've forgotten? If this raised something for you, an agreement, a disagreement, or even just a question, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Not answers, just what this brought up for you. I read them.